Right. We are this morning.
Recording in progress.
I found out I actually can't stop that. It's a new feature. That's right. We are this morning on the downhill slide in 2 Corinthians. We've got this passage. If I don't talk too windedly, we'll get done through chapter 12, verse 10 today. I think I gave you a stretch goal. I gave myself a stretch goal, and I don't think I'm going to meet my stretch goal. I think I'll probably pull a hammy doing that stretch. But we'll finish up probably with chapter 12 next week, and then chapter 13 maybe the week after. So we may go another third week after that, but it looks like we'll finish up by July 4th. Now, just a reminder, we talked about this in the announcements of previous service. July 4th, we won't have a Sunday school. There's just one combined service at 10:30, and after that we'll have a luncheon. So we won't actually have anything that day. And if everything we end up with Corinthians is the way I think it will, then we'll start with the topic of what happens when you die, coming up on, what would that be, July 11th or so, 7/11. All right, so today we're in the 2 Corinthians zone. And again, this chapter 10 through chapter 13 has been this long discourse by Paul, really defending his ministry. And he's going bit by bit by bit. But at this point, he's reaching his culmination, the peak of it. And so it becomes important for us to both pay attention and for me not to meander too far. Paul starts off this section now directly confronting the accusers and the false apostles. He's humbly admitted some things already. He doesn't have a great voice. He's not skilled in public speaking. But his physical credentials outshine his opponents. One thing that stands out above all, Paul was willing to suffer humiliation for the sake of the gospel. So Paul will talk about his strengths first, and by the time we wind up with the end of the chapter, Paul will switch to focus on his shortcomings. And in essence, his weaknesses prove that the power of God is evident in the ministry, because it's not Paul himself accomplishing it, it's God through Paul. Paul just makes sure that God is the one who shines on that. So let's read. We're going to start off at chapter 11, verse 21, and we'll read down to verse 29 just for this initial go. So 1 Corinthians 11, starting at 21. To my shame, I must say, we were too weak for that. But whatever anyone else dares to boast of, I am speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast of that. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they offspring of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I am a better one. I am talking like a madman, with far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings and often near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes, less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. At night and a day I was adrift at sea. On frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at the sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak, and I am not weak? Who is made to fall, and I am not indignant? Let's go and continue on to the end of the chapter. If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. The God and Father of the Lord Jesus, he who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. At Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me, but I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. So as we continue on, again, the kind of discussion this morning that Paul's trying to enter in is, in some sense, foolishness. Because Paul's trying to say, I really don't like this idea of bragging. I really don't like this idea of telling you everything I've done and everything I've been through, because almost make it look like I'm the one who did it. And that's going to be Paul's conclusion, is that no, it's not me, it's actually God through me. And in my weakness, I'm made strong. Paul brings it up because the false apostles are depending upon their birth, their ancestry, their religion, their allegiances. And Paul admits that this whole line of argument is in some sense silly, in some sense foolish. The idea of being foolish is the state or a lack of prudence, of good judgment, a lack of sense, and it's moral and intellectual. It's not just not lacking sense as in untrained, it's lacking sense as in they're choosing to believe a wrong thing, an immoral thing. And so the foolishness is it makes Paul uncomfortable with where he's going. Are they Hebrews? Are they Israelites? Are they offspring of Abraham? Are they the servants of Christ? I'm a better one. I mentioned before that one of the individuals I'm really helped by in his coverage of I think it's a guy named David Garland. He says, one's good breeding was a standard topic of Hellenistic rhetoric. In other words, if you wanted to make sure that you stood well before your population, tell them who you're born of. Tell them who was your father. Tell me who was your grandfather. Tell me what religion you came from. Tell me what city you came from. Tell me who were your people. And that was a popular in really all of both the Greek religion and Roman religion was based upon the Greek as well. So it was not uncommon to be able to recall upon who you're from. Paul wastes no words or time in dealing with the false apostles' cancel culture, because they were really saying, you're not of us, we don't want to hear you. We're gonna make sure you get off Facebook or the Facebook of the ancient Near East. We're gonna make sure you're off Twitter of the ancient Near East. Now they're trying to cancel, if you will, the Apostle Paul. But Paul says, first of all, he was a Hebrew. And here the word is used as a sign of respect. Paul had that very respect for these people. The inscription on the synagogue in Corinth reads, Synagogue of the Hebrews. So it was meant to notify, it was meant to essentially wrap your arms around what is a Hebrew of, we have a common language and a common race. Paul's term recalls their language and their race. The Hebrew wasn't just who they were descended from, that they were descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They also had a common language, actually one of the first written languages that we can actually find. So being a Hebrew was a term of respect for Paul for where he came from, of the religion that they got engaged in, their learning, their expressions, their language, their culture, every aspect of that was what it meant to be a Hebrew. Paul says, they say the false apostles say they're Hebrews. I'm a Hebrew as well. Paul said he was an Israelite. Denotes not only the race into which one was born, but his carrying out the religion into which he was born also. Israel is the name conferred on Jacob by God. The Messiah would come from Israel. Being of Israel is a good thing because it was born into because of a covenant relationship with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Being an Israelite means you have certain rites and practices, whether it's circumcision or the sacrifices you would make. It meant to be the totality of the religion that the Hebrews practiced. So Hebrew was essentially the race, and Israelite was the company you kept because of who you were descended from and the practices of the culture. Paul says he was an offspring of Abraham. Again, the false apostles have been saying this thing about themselves. We're Hebrews, we're Israelites, we're offspring of Abraham. And so continuing down this path, Paul narrows it down to being a beneficiary of the Abrahamic covenant. Israel was promised land and a seed or offspring. And if you read if you read Romans chapter 9 through 11, it's predicated upon that promise that they were a covenant people, and God's going to bring them back for a certain purpose. We'll actually look into some of that when we get into what happens when you die series. I'm not going to be teaching on Romans chapter 9, 10, 11. Everybody know who Martin Lloyd-Jones is? He spent, I think, several years, plural, teaching through Romans. I'm not going to be teaching several years, plural, and not even 9, 10, 11. We'll talk in summary fashion. Scripture is predicated upon the idea of God has a relationship with Israel, and you can't escape that unless either that or God's a liar, one of the two. Right? So if we look at it from that perspective, God has a relationship with them. Yes, they've abandoned the covenant, but God is still after their heart. So He was a Hebrew, he was an Israelite, he was an offspring of Abraham, and finally, Paul says he was a servant of Christ. Finally, Paul brings this up, and apparently the false apostles were doing this too, but here Paul has the backing of Christ, who would warn of false followers, false prophets. They'd given themselves the title of apostles. So, to be an apostle, it wasn't just, I recognize that I love to teach, therefore I'm a teacher. But rather, you teach when you're recognized by others that you have the gift of teaching. It's not some proclamation you make about yourself. But the false apostles were doing exactly that about their mission. No one had appointed them, certainly not Christ had not appointed them, and the other apostles had not appointed these false teachers, these false apostles as apostles. They just said, we're on a mission, therefore we're apostles, and we're good at it too. We're of the Hebrews, we're of the Israelites, we're of Abraham, but not of Christ. And that's where Paul starts to distinguish what's going on. They had not been handed a commission by Christ himself. They were not taking the gospel to new places. They were not even preaching Christ. They were busy tearing down Paul for the money that they would get because it made them look good. They were following Paul's lead, building on Paul's foundation, going to the places Paul already established. And their denigration of Paul and the way that they treated his ministry and the love for the Corinthians told it all. And that's part of what the next section is going to be then. How much does Paul love the Corinthians? And we've been through that before. He spent a year and a half before. He's had numerous letters he's written. He's about ready to visit for the third time. He sends his best people there, like Titus, to be able to communicate his heart in a way that's acceptable. And I can't imagine how hard it was for Paul to be able to bring this up. But the reputation of God is at stake. And again, I'm struck every week as we go through this section, how much like David and Goliath this is. Will no one stand up for the Lord? The Lord's name is essentially what Paul's really saying here. Because if the false apostles denigrate Paul, they tear down Paul, they run down Paul, they're really running down God, because God is the one who put Paul in place. Paul and God the Father and the Son. So it's the reputation of God that's at stake. So he says in chapter 11, verse 23, I'm talking like a madman, with far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings, and often near death. Now, Paul starts to separate himself from the false apostles in these substantive ways, in these very tangible ways. Paul's not trying to mock his enemies. He's just simply, as someone said, trying to outboast the boasters. He's going to be able to tell you exactly what he did, because this is what proves his weakness. That his weakness was taken advantage of by God in order to accomplish all of those things. Paul didn't accomplish setting up new churches in new places. He didn't accomplish bringing converts in by his own strength. God did that through Paul. Paul was just the vessel. So he starts to separate himself by outboasting the boasters. He has far greater labors, far more reaching than in terms of geography that was covered. More people reached, more geography covered, more people converted. And Paul's brought this up before. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 10 says, but by the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that's in me. So this has been a theme within the Corinthians, not as they get to 2 Corinthians, it's not brand new. Paul's had to constantly say, it's God's grace working through me. He had far more imprisonments and beatings, illnesses and physical ailments that brought him close to death. And the way that Paul puts or expresses the issues, this was a normal occurrence. Where are the beatings and imprisonments of these super apostles on behalf of Christ? Where are they at saying, we're ready to be servants of Jesus as well? Because they're differentiating themselves. They're putting themselves saying, we're really the sponsors of these false, of these other teachers, whether it's Apollos or Paul or Cephas or anybody else. We don't want that kind of division, but being who we are, we're apostles, we know that. They're willing to sponsor other teachers, and so make themselves look great in the people's eyes. And we've talked before about how they would love to be the elite, and they would love to then be able to say, because we're elite and we're sponsoring all these teachers, you can build us a monument if you want. It's okay. You can build us a road or a statue. We're perfectly fine with that. And Paul's having none of that. He's really trying to separate himself now. As Paul is the humble one, the one who's gone through these trials and tribulations because of Christ. We're the false apostles addressing the same thing. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea. On frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there's the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. There's something like 20-some identifications of the things that Paul went through here. And when you read through them, you also get the idea that this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is not the end of what Paul went through. This is just a summary fashion, a summary list to be able to highlight for you. The beating of 39 lashes was the official punishment of the synagogue. They would do it for something they perceived as heresy. The beating with rods was a Roman punishment. Either Paul always didn't appeal to his Roman citizenship, or the Roman officials, depending on city by city, often ignored the pleas. So Paul would be beaten by his very own people, the Hebrews, the Israelites, the children of Abraham, or he would be beaten by the Romans. But you recall, Paul was a Roman citizen, and sometimes did proclaim, you can't do this, I'm a Roman citizen. And people go, whoa, I can't do that. Indeed. Well, what would you like to do? I think I'd like to go see Caesar. And you can imagine the eye roll at that point. Paul didn't feel that every time he turned around, but rather he was willing to endure the suffering because of what else it would be able to offer, what else he'd be able to do. It says he was stoned. This is likely in Lystra. There was a mob action there. It says he was shipwrecked 3 times. Lest you think, we don't view sailing that big of a deal here. Depending on whether you're on a lake or Lake Michigan or the ocean, it's not the life-threatening issue that it was then. Secundus, who's a silent philosopher, said that was asking a dialogue with the Emperor Hadrian, what is a boat? His response was, a boat is a sea-tossed object, a foundationless home, a well-crafted tomb, a wood cubicle, a flying prison, a confined fate, a plaything of the wind, sailing death, an open cage, uncertain safety, the prospect of death. It doesn't sound like an enjoyable pastime, does it? So we talked about this a few weeks ago, the idea of being between a rock and a hard place, between Charybdis and I'm going to get the names wrong, but it follows an old Greek myth that there was trying to sail through this place where there were eddies and rocks, and it was very difficult to sail through, but it was the main way to get there, and you had to time your going right, or literally your boat could be dashed against the rocks. Sailing was not an enjoyable pastime. Sailing was a death-defying adventure. So Hadrian continues to go on. He says, "What's a sailor?" Secundus replies, "A neighbor of death." A modern has defined the sea as a large body of water surrounded by trouble, and defined it's definitely not a cruise, but it's always fraught with trouble. Paul's saying that to get from one place to another, in my weakness, I had to take boats, and it was not always a safe thing. And so again, he was willing to put his life at risk for those things. Crossing rivers, again, we don't give a second thought to crossing a river now. But can you imagine if there was no modern bridge building across rivers right now? If it was just a 6 2x4s,
No.
kind of wrapped together with
I would never know what was on the other side.
Yeah, crossing rivers was always a danger as well. There were bandits. While Rome ruled the area, Rome didn't have any presence or any army presence in every place, and there were places where bandits took advantage of that gap and the missing police presence. We've talked before. This is not actually a new thing, but the old songs of ascents, Psalm 122 to 130 something. They would often groups would going back to Jerusalem to celebrate feasts would gather together and walk together. and would sing these songs for two reasons. They gather together and sing the songs to be able to ward off bandits, saying there's more than just one of us here. Just kind of stay away. So there were psalms and poems that they would sing on their way. Now they'd get to the temple as well, and then they would actually stand on the steps that are there and sing the songs as they ascended to the Temple Mount as well. But as you went up to Jerusalem, you would sing these songs to ward off bandits. Jews, he had hostility from Jews, hostility from the Jews in nearly every city. We've looked before at Damascus or Jerusalem or Antioch of Pisidia, Iconium, Lystra, Thessalonica, Berea, Corinth, and then finally again in Jerusalem. Every place Paul goes, there's a mob action, and the Jews are at the heart of it. He had problems with the Gentiles as well. Paul's gospel threatened the livelihood of silversmiths, like the silversmith in Ephesus. The silversmith is the one who started, as people would be converts to Christianity, they would stop buying silver, which put the silversmiths kind of in a pinch because there's no money going after the things that they're selling now. And prices dropped, and it's, and negative inflation, and just all sorts of microeconomic issues. So they no longer bought meat as well in the markets. So they trumped up charges that Paul was disturbing the peace, which always brought the threat of Rome coming back in and occupying the cities again. There was danger in the city, danger in wilderness, danger at sea, danger from the false brothers. Everywhere Paul went. These are the dangers of travelers. One might stay at an inn, not at and it wouldn't be an inn like today, a Hilton or a Marriott or a Holiday Inn or a Johnson's. It would be a ramshackle lean-to that was likely to have bandits who hung out there to see what they couldn't get that was on the road. It was a place of great risk as well. In toil and hardship, sleepless nights, in order not to be a burden, Paul maintained his skills as a tent maker. But full-time ministering and then working to make a living requires a lot of sacrifice of time and sleep. Paul looked like he would make tents during the day, and then he would minister and teach at night when people were not working. And in order to do that, Paul still had to prepare for the tent making for the next day. And oftentimes, had this piece where he would have sleepless nights, and often would result in hunger and thirst as well. When he says in hunger and thirst, often without food and cold and exposure. The difference between hunger and thirst is really not enough food, versus without food means that he's going without food as a voluntary exercise. And I think what Paul's referring to is voluntary fasts, that he's going to, knowing that this makes your prayer that much sharper. As we went through personal spiritual disciplines, we kind of took a notice of that fasting with a purpose can have great exaltation to God, but a discrete focus upon the thing you're praying upon. Every time you have a hunger pain, you're reminded to pray. And that's what Paul's referring to, I think, here. The idea of exposure oftentimes is translated nakedness in some of your translations. It's not really what it means. It just means lacking sufficient clothing. Meaning that if it were winter and you and I would be putting on parkas, Paul might have a shawl in order to keep him warm. And that's all he had to keep him warm. So it wasn't he was naked, he was without proper protection from the elements. Apart from other things, which means that there's more. Paul could have gone on and on and on about the things that he has been deprived of. But when we look at the result, the points made, the list is illustrative, it's not complete. But then he says, this is my daily pressure. There is this daily pressure of my anxiety for all the churches. Well, the daily pressure is really the responsibility. Paul viewed himself and all the churches that he started, he viewed himself as having a responsibility to be with those people, to communicate with the people, to share with the people, to engage with the people. And he would go back on his next visits, he would go back and visit those churches again, as well as, I'm sure, write and get engaged with them. He had a responsibility to him. He has a team working with him, and he cares for them, and they could be going through the same issues as Paul himself. But he watches out for them, and he watches over them. Now, this idea of anxiety isn't like you and I would view anxiety today, but really he's talking about an intense care. The idea of the parable of the sower comes to mind. Now, Luke chapter 8, verse 14. And as for what fell among the thorns, there are those who hear. But as they go on their way, they're choked by the cares and riches and pleasures of life, and their fruit does not mature. That idea of cares is what Paul uses as the word anxiety. They have cares that Paul naturally cares for the people that he brought to Christ. What the Corinthians are getting the idea too is Paul naturally cares for them through the letters and the visits and the concern and the tears and even the deprivations that we've seen today. Paul cares for them, that they be able to hear the gospel, that they be able to live the gospel and be a lamp, a light stand, really, if you will, in Achaia, to all the other nations. Every Christian center that Paul's established, every church he planted and invested time in and resources was always at the cost of personal sacrifice. And they always claimed his thoughts and his sympathy going forward. His minds were always towards those places. So imagine, again, if you planted several dozen churches, it's hard enough being a pastor of one church, but let alone having the care to continually write, continually visit, continually care for it, continue to pray for those dozen or so churches that he's established. It's mind-boggling to think that that's what occupied his thoughts. That's where the idea of cares or anxiety comes into play. And then verse 29 concludes, just to reiterate that thought, Paul would often say in his letters to churches, always in every prayer, never cease to pray, constantly making mention of you. Paul was always bringing up the idea of constantly being in prayer for these individuals, and that's because Paul cared. Verse 29 concludes with the explanation of anxiety with some rhetorical questions. He says, and get back to verse 29, who is weak, and I am not weak? Who is made to fall, and I am not indignant? If one of the people that Paul cares for and is caring for is indicted somehow, if they're somehow affected by their troubles and tribulations, Paul is saying, I too am troubled if they're troubled. So that's where he's coming to. Who is weak, and I am not weak? If one of my individuals gets sick or hurt or is out of job or is persecuted for their belief, I'm with them. It bothers me that much inside. That's what he's saying in this verse. Who is made to fall, and I am not indignant. If someone's persecution leads to bodily injury or even death, Paul himself is pleading with God for justice in those circumstances. If one of his charges is affected, Paul takes the brunt. He sympathizes with those who are hurting, with those who are persecuted or suffering, as if he himself is suffering. Now, by extension, he's saying that the false apostles that we're pointing to don't have any of this. They don't have the deprivations, they don't have the care, they don't have the anxiety, they don't have the overall overarching concern for the people they've established. They're just concerned about themselves. So 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 20. Remember, we looked at it last week. For you bear it if someone makes slaves of you, or devours you, or takes advantage of you, or puts on airs, or strikes you in the face. Paul is asking, if you see all these things, and the way to properly care for and pastor churches is this way, to do without food, to do without proper clothing, to do without the extravagances of, even to do with just comfortable things like a nice bed and nice clothing, or even just appropriate clothing for the weather. If to do without those things is what it means to pastor, where are the false apostles on this scale? They're in the I don't care phase. And the false apostles yet claim superiority, that they're better in their speaking, they're better in their sponsorship, they're better in their argumentation. They don't bear the marks of true Christianity in any way, shape, or form. They're not suffering for Christ, which is why Paul can get to say, as we read at the very beginning, Paul is better. All right, so we get to verse 30. He says, if I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. Now, with this, Paul's kind of transitioning from, he's giving you the list of things that he's given up for the sake of the gospel and the sake of establishing the kingdom. He's given up these things, and yet he's going to turn to talk about how that demonstrates his weakness on one part. But now let's transition and let's look at more very specifically, two specific examples. The first one we look at is in these next verses with King Aretas, who is guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me. So Paul's in the city of Damascus. Remember, Paul was on his way to Damascus getting saved, and this is sometime a little bit later, a few years later. So Paul's done with comparisons, but there's more to the Corinthians at this point to know the difference between Paul and the false apostles. He needs to detail his weaknesses, first to keep himself humble, and second of all, to show God's surpassing greatness and supply for the ministry and the churches that have been entrusted to him. So he goes through King Aretas. I'm losing my notes here. I have my notes. I'm lost in my notes. So then he says, first of all, the God and Father of the Lord Jesus, who is blessed forever. It's following something called an oath formula. It precedes what's to follow by defining it as truth. God knows that I'm not lying is the same thing as God is witness to the truth that I say. So he's calling upon God. Paul himself is a witness to what went on, of what God is doing, and he's calling God as another witness to testify to what Paul is saying. So he's very much using a specific formula called an oath formula to be able to say, I'm calling upon God in this way to tell you all that I'm saying the truth, right? And the Spirit will communicate that to you. What follows could seem incredible. What happened under King Aretas and the ascent into paradise seemed fantastic on the face of it. Now, we haven't read the paradise thing. We'll get to that in a few minutes. Could seem fantastic on the face of it. Paul's trustworthiness was questioned earlier in the letter when it seemed as if Paul said one thing and did another. So Paul's going to talk about his weakness, and what it does is actually verify his trustworthiness, his truthfulness. The escape is sometime soon after he's saved and has gone into Arabia. And for this first example of Paul's weakness, he recalls that he had to escape with the help of friends in almost a humiliating way. The basket, I've had a hard time my entire life envisioning this basket. It's a huge basket. And this last time we went to Israel, we're just bebopping along. And I just happened to notice outside on one of the roads in the city of Jericho, as we're going to lunch, there's this basket shop. And they've got not just small, medium, large, they've got small, medium, large, ginormous, and man-sized. There's a basket that was every bit of 6 foot tall.
Did they have the Paul's special?
Yeah. With gold. No, and so I actually saw one. It was about maybe 5.5, 6 feet tall. So now this is today, this is 2,000 years later, but they have made baskets that are that big to be able to carry stuff. The problem is, what did they carry in them? It was things like fish. So, carrying fish in a basket's one thing. Being let down in a basket that was carrying fish in a basket is humiliating, as well as a bit odoriferous. It has a smell that you're just not going to get shaken off of your boots for a little bit. So the baskets are there. Paul's not exaggerating that the baskets are there, but it's humiliating to have to leave the city almost as if Paul was there, and this was first part of what he was trying to do was minister in Damascus, and he had to escape with his tail between his legs. I think that's one interpretation. It wouldn't be a hill to die on, that's the interpretation. But it seems like Paul's trying to, again, talk about the humiliating aspect of what went on there. And Paul had to escape with his tail between his legs in a humiliating place.
I'm just thinking that would Paul have received the same treatment had he gone to Damascus with his original intent?
Oh no, Paul would have been welcomed with open arms, because he was beating down those rebel-rousing Christians. So this next section we're going to look at in chapter 12 then, and we'll read this down to verse 10. So chapter 12, verses 1 to 10. This next section, 12, 1 to 10, is really the second instance of humiliation I'm going to share with you. First one, I had to leave under suspicious circumstances under King Aretas. The second one is this humiliating thing that happened to me with this thorn in the flesh. We'll talk about that. So chapter 12, verse 1. I must go on boasting. Though there is nothing to be gained by it, I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. Now, let me just stop there. Only to say that when he uses this visions and revelations, he's likely using a phrase that the false apostles have used, that they had a vision and revelation that they've been granted the ability to be apostles. Christ himself didn't do it. The other apostles in Jerusalem didn't do it, but rather we see that we're really good at it, so we're going to be apostles today. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up into the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man cannot utter. On behalf of this man, I will boast, but on my own behalf, I will not boast, except of my weakness. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. So to keep me from being conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. So when he says, I must go out boasting, and goes on to visions again, he's recalling the things that the false apostles have been saying as well. When he asks the question, not rhetorically, he says, what can be gained by it? The idea of gained by it is to be, what is advantageous? What's a help? What's a benefit? What's to be profitable or useful? I mean, what am I going to get out of it? If I talk about what I did, what's going to come out of it? And it's really a statement of ultimate irony. I've heard people use these verses, for instance, they're prescriptive as to how we ought to be seeking a word from the Lord. Paul says right here that it won't help build up the church. It's not useful or purposeful or profitable. And Paul reviews it because of the goal of setting the false apostles on their heels and for them to become defensive. Did God reveal himself in this way? This happened to me as apostle. How about you? It didn't. I mean, he's dealing into short, close jabs into the ribs of, in the boxing scenario. He's really putting it to the false apostles and where their motivation is coming from. He's really highlighting that their motivation is all about themselves. Paul was on one of his first missions and was exposed, and what was exposed was some of his weaknesses. How many of the super apostles could point to a time when they were wholly dependent upon the Lord and their weaknesses were exposed? Paul's telling you what happened early on with him, and it didn't go well. The false apostles are going to tell you, no, we're God's apostles. Everything went right. And you ought to see their resume. I mean, it's a stellar resume. And what Paul's saying is, mine's stellar too, but it's full of so many pitfalls. And it fell short because of these things that I didn't do right. And Paul doesn't really even go into all that, but he says, I was weak, but God is the one who is shown to be strong here. So the context of what comes next is a vision or revelation from the Lord. Paul actually saw little value in going through it. Paul uses it as an example of his weakness that's made manifest. So what do we have? 14 years ago, someone Paul knows was caught up into paradise. And what he saw can't even be uttered out loud. What's that about? This is about Paul because Paul is reviewing his weakness. So, one of the questions comes about in terms of hermeneutics. Who's Paul talking about? Which of his friends is he speaking of? Is he speaking of them in the third person? Well, he's actually speaking of himself in the third person. But he doesn't wish to point out that it's himself, even though by this point it is, because whose weakness is he reviewing? His own. So he's not giving you an example of somebody else to talk about his weakness. He's talking about his weakness, but in the third person, so it doesn't seem so direct. Yeah, John?
If I want to believe in Paul, I'm totally impressed by all this. If I'm his opponent, I would say, well, wait a minute, now I got this guy, he said he went to heaven, but won't tell us He claims that everything he does, God is doing it through him and so forth. And I would say, yeah, and he says he's not boasting, but he is boasting. You know, it's kind of, well, not, I mean, I take the side of Paul, of course. But
Yeah.
I'm thinking, you know, this is a tough sell.
It's a tough sell. Well, a couple things. It's a tough sell because all of the church of the Corinthians is not against Paul. It's just some. So he's trying to attack this small group of believers that are there and this other group of believers that have come in from the outside. And most commentators, I think, believe that these false apostles are believers, but they're so misguided. But what he's going to get to is that it's not someone's CV, their curriculum vitae, so their resume that makes them strong. All their accomplishments, it's their weaknesses that become the benefit to the church itself.
So you say the false believer, false apostle?
That's what most commentators
They're
think.
just mistaken.
Huh?
They're just mistaken about themselves?
Yeah.
Crazy. I mean, that's nuts.
Well, he probably refers to it, he says, am I a madman? Almost implying, yeah, they're mad. They're none of your Mad Hatter. Mixed metaphor somehow.
I guess they weren't really opposing him, but once they heard what he was saying.
Well, and I think, Paul will, after he gets done writing this letter and he sends Titus on ahead, Paul will follow in after, and he'll settle down there for a few months. So it's not like he went in, parachuted in, solved everything. He went in and amongst them, and I think there's this city's brought to peace as a result.
That makes no sense to me. They're not absolute enemies.
Well,
they're terribly mistaken.
The only thing I would quibble, John, is the idea of an enemy is someone who's out for their own good, not for your good. And they're out for actually they're actually decidedly against, not for Paul's good. They're for themselves. Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, why act that way is a whole other thing. This is a vision that comes directly from the Lord. Several commentators think that Paul's just going through a list of the accusations made against him. And you see that kind of outline from chapter 10 through chapter 13 of point, as if Paul's reading the list that they provided for him. Saying, let's talk about this. Except I don't think they said, let's talk about this. Paul's reading out from a list as if to say, I'm going to respond to this, and this. And this is towards the last part of his list. Chapter 13 is right around the corner. So he's responding to that list. Remember that the Corinthians, though, they liked flashy, showy gifts and manifestations of the Spirit. And the false apostles, no doubt, have seized upon them as a way to discredit Paul. So Paul's looking to say, look, you want visions and revelations? I've had them. No big deal. Anybody can have them. But this is not who we are. Who we are is what we care about, and seeing God work through us, not what we've done ourselves for God. So, 14 years ago, talks about, and if, as I believe, 2 Corinthians is written about 57 AD or so. This puts us at about 45 AD or so. And this would be in this missing years where Paul, his early ministry in Cilicia and Syria, when Claudius was emperor. So this is this missing period of time. Where did Paul go and what did he do? And essentially out in the wilderness, and we don't know what he did, but he was there and was ministered to and ministered, apparently. One of the questions that comes up, though, is why third person? Only a few people in Scripture have been snatched up into visions and revelations of this sort. By referring to himself in the third person, Paul seems to be staying away from associating himself with them. In other words, if I think about visions that people have had, whether it's Moses or David or somebody else, Paul doesn't want to put himself in the same company with them. Although he'll say, I'm a better apostle, I'm a better servant than Moses was. Paul's still trying to be humble and saying, these are still great servants of the Lord. I'm not trying to put myself in the same boat, if you will, with them. Or that we're not on the same plane. This kind of boasting shows that, like the false apostles, he had visions that were too wonderful even to put words to. Which again, you have to wonder about the nature of what some folks claim they have visions for. Now, even in our day and age, people claim to go to heaven. Again, we'll talk about some of the implications and practical aspects of this when we get to what happens when you die. People talk about being ascended into heaven and seeing this person walking around and that, granny this and
Yeah.
And we'll talk about how much that can't be true when we get into what happens when you die. I'm now starting to put a lot writing on that series, aren't I? No, Paul couldn't speak about it. It was that wonderful. But today, no problem. We can talk about how a person saw this wonderful thing or that wonderful person. Paul says, I refrain from it. In fact, I voluntarily abstain from it because there's no point in it. Nobody gains anything by going through that specific vision other than me, myself, and what I saw. A validation of gifts comes from what others recognize in you, not what you see in yourself. And this is one of the problems I have with the spiritual gifts inventory. You've all taken those spiritual gifts inventory, like, a list of 150 questions for you. And when you get done, lo and behold, these three things are your gifts.
Pick the gift you want.
Which, pick a gift you want is exactly it. They tend to validate what you believe about yourself, not what other people believe in you. But when you look at, for instance, the New Testament and what it says about how to identify leaderships don't say, I'm good at being a leader, I think I'll be a leader today. They get essentially put into position because others see that they're good leaders. So that you see the practice first, and then the title comes second. The spiritual gifts inventory tend to validate what you think about yourself. We looked at the word think last week, to understand, to rationalize based on the evidence. What kind of evidence have they seen in Paul? All the hardships we've mentioned above, countless hours teaching, preaching, convincing, discussing with the Corinthians. For 18 months, then letters, then his best envoy in Titus, and now return visits. Paul's given everything to be with the Corinthians. Paul has demonstrated to them that he's willing to commit to them. What he wants to be. Now, when he says, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. Paul's presence is not unknown. He talks about this earlier in the letter. I don't have to write a letter of commendation. You know who I am. You've seen me. You've expressed love towards me. I express love towards you. We're in this together. But these false apostles, we can't have this. Right? It's dividing the church. It's splitting the church in two. And furthermore, it denigrates God's kingdom because it's God who's not getting the glory. No, it says in verse 7, no, it was wonderful enough for Paul to keep from boasting about it, some kind of ailment that kept Paul, that is his thorn in the flesh. It was some kind of ailment that kept Paul from boasting about his experience. There's been so much ink spilled over speculation about what the thorn was. But one of the things I find interesting is that when you start looking at the word, is that thorn's a convenient thing because, let me take a step back and we're going to run out of time. And so we'll probably actually pick up with this. But remember back when we talked about manuscripts and getting our Bible in the English version and a guy named Tyndale? Tyndale, even today, upwards of 70% of the Bible are using Tyndale's words that he translated. Even today, almost 400 years later. Thorn is one of those words. And so thorn here actually means more like a stake. I mean, we're not talking a little tiny thing which the lion got caught in its paw. We're talking about a stake. So Paul is not dealing with a little tiny inconvenience. Paul's dealing with something that's causing a major inconvenience, a major disturbance in his life. So don't picture this little tiny splinter. Picture a stake, a long wooden stake. That's the idea that's used of this word. Let's see. So what's interesting though is that Paul never describes what the stake actually is. He doesn't just say, it's my eyes, it's my back, it's my knees. Never gives us a solid idea of what this. But what he says, it's enough to keep me from looking at myself. Even though I've been praying to the Lord to resolve it, I know that I'll never be something great because this is keeping me back from doing something else. And he doesn't resolve with exaltation. Right. So we're gonna actually cut it off there because I think the next portion is we'll come into the next portion. I don't think it doesn't throw us off very much. But again, verse 7. So to keep me from being conceited because of the surpassing greatness and revelations, a thorn was given me, a stake was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from being conceited. And we'll talk then next week about the prayers and what it all means. But again, this is the culmination of the argument that Paul's trying to bring. This is kind of like the peak or the pinnacle of where Paul's trying to go in this defense of his apostleship, which is really a defense of God's work through the Apostle Paul and how he's then trying to overcome the accusations against him. All right, let me stop there. Any questions, comments, criticisms, complaints, existential crisis? Yeah,
That's how.
next week?
It's about the going place.
Okay, yeah, so we'll, all right. Right,
When you see the list of what Paul has explained that he's done, say, what do you face?
Yeah.
By comparison?
yeah, our air conditioning out might be a struggle, yeah. The struggle's real, man. No, when we look at that list, we're not giving up much at all to be able to carry on our work with this in the Spirit for the work of Christ.
Yes.
And that's what he's really calling us to, is not to exalt ourselves, but look at God, at the work that God's doing through us. And that's where our weakness becomes so important, because if we don't let God do the work for us, we're doing it on our own.
Well, and considering that this too, you can easily say, God didn't really help him. I mean, he suffered all this, in spreading the gospel. Where was God's help?
Yeah, I even think, Ron, to your point, the false apostles used that with, if he was really of God, he would have been blessed along the way. He would be probably rich. He wouldn't have had any of these problems. He would have gotten along with people left and right. He would have been given the keys to the kingdom rather than having the keys to the jailhouse taken away.
And they probably thought he would be more like us, and yet he suffered at night.
Right. And so that, they're getting slowly put in their place for sure. So, all right. Good observation. All right, let's close in prayer, shall we? Father, we thank you for Paul's example. Father, even as we care for the church, Father, give us that heart to be able to, in our weakness, let your grace and your strength and your glory shine through. Father, we do care for this church, what you're doing through it, and know that you're continuing to work with us, and we're grateful for that. But Father, give us hearts that are transformed for you, hearts that are working for you, all to your glory's sake, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we will see you next week.